This is my neighborhood, not yours. You don't belong here.
We bought this house, sir.
You people don't belong here. This neighborhood is for us.
We bought this house. We're staying.
The glint of the polished marble floor caught Michael's eye as he stepped into the luxury hotel lobby. His heart beat in his throat, trying to mask the discomfort, but he couldn't hide the anger burning within him. The sound of clinking glasses and soft jazz filtered through the air as rich, white businessmen in tailored suits walked past without even acknowledging him. Then, the insult came like a slap to his face. A well-dressed man in his late 50s, his skin as white as the pristine white walls of the hotel, turned sharply and looked Michael up and down. "Well, this isn't a place for your kind," he sneered, his voice dripping with condescension. "The back door's around the corner if you need to find a way out." Michael's pulse roared in his ears. He fought the urge to lash out, to scream, to break something. His eyes locked on the man's face, studying the arrogance in his posture. It was the kind of look that Michael had seen too many times. The kind of look that didn't see people like him, didn't see his family as worthy of respect. A sharp breath in. "You don't belong here." The words lingered in the space between them, suffocating Michael. He glanced over to the side where his daughter Yasmin stood with wide eyes, her innocence now shattered. This moment, this horrible, degrading moment, was one they'd carry with them forever. The man's smile twisted. "Good luck, loser." A chill shot through Michael's spine. It was the kind of day that could change everything. And, in 24 hours it would. The elegant marble floors of the hotel gleamed under the soft glow of chandeliers, each one casting an ethereal light over the bustling lobby. Michael Harris shifted uncomfortably in his uniform. Polished shoes, dark slacks, and a button-up shirt, pressed with precision but no glamour. His daughter, Yasmin, stood beside him, her eyes wide with excitement as she took in the opulence of the room. The event he'd been invited to felt like a dream, a chance to rub elbows with the upper echelons of corporate America, to be seen as more than just a janitor for one night. But nothing prepared him for what would happen next. A well-dressed man, his suit cut perfectly and his tie a shade of blue that spoke of wealth, approached with a confident air. His silver hair gleamed, and he looked Michael up and down, his gaze sharpening like a blade. A slow smile spread across his lips, and Michael could feel the insult gathering on the tip of his tongue. "Well, this isn't a place for your kind," the man said with a sneer, his voice dripping with superiority. Michael's breath hitched. Yasmin's hand, once resting lightly on his arm, tightened. She glanced at him with confusion, then back at the man who seemed to take pleasure in his discomfort. His words were sharp, cutting through the air between them like a knife. "The back door's around the corner if you need to find a way out." It was a subtle insult, yet its weight hung heavy. Michael could feel his pulse quicken, the blood rushing in his ears. He wanted to lash out, to shout, but the presence of his daughter kept him in check. Yasmin looked at him, the innocent curiosity in her eyes now replaced by something else, an understanding of the world's cruelty she wasn't prepared for. "You don't belong here," the man said, his smirk widening as he took a step back, obviously pleased with his power. The sting of the words didn't fade, even after the man turned and walked away. Michael stood frozen, trying to calm the fury that boiled in his chest. Yasmin's voice cut through the silence, barely above a whisper. "Dad." What did he mean? The question was simple, yet it held the weight of everything Michael couldn't explain. He cleared his throat, forcing a smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "It's nothing, Yasmin," he lied, his voice thick with emotion. "Some people are just ignorant." But deep down, he knew this moment would not pass. It would stay with them forever. And the man's words, his casual, cruel dismissal, would not go unanswered. Michael couldn't shake the image of the man's smirk, or the feeling of Yasmin's hand tightening around his arm. She was too young to understand what had just happened, but he could see the confusion in her eyes. He could see her processing the words, the subtle cruelty wrapped in the man's smile, and it made his stomach twist. They left the hotel in silence, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the empty hallway, carrying the weight of their shared humiliation. As they drove home, Yasmin stared out of the window, her reflection barely visible in the glass. The city lights flickered as they passed, but Michael couldn't find any comfort in them. His mind raced, replaying the incident over and over, each time feeling sharper, more cutting. "You okay?" Michael asked softly, his voice breaking through the quiet. Yasmin didn't look at him. "What did he mean, Dad? Why didn't he want us there?" The question came so innocently, but Michael felt the sharp pang of reality cut through him. He didn't want to explain the world's ugliness to his daughter, not yet, not like this. But he could see the wheels turning in her mind, already searching for answers. It's just the way some people are," he said, his voice thick with the weight of unspoken truths. "They think they're better than others just because of the color of their skin or how much money they have. It's not right, but it happens." She was silent for a long moment, then spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "So, we're not good enough." Michael's heart broke at the sadness in her voice. "No, Yasmin. You're more than good enough. Don't ever think you're not." But deep down, Michael felt the sting of those words too. He had fought his whole life to prove that he was good enough, only to face these moments of bitter reality again and again. It wasn't just the isolated insults. It was the constant systemic forces that worked against people like him. Every day, a new reminder that no matter how hard he worked, no matter how much he sacrificed, there were still those who saw him as less. Later that night, after Yasmin had gone to bed, Michael sat at the kitchen table, his mind spinning. He couldn't stop thinking about the rich man at the hotel, the arrogance in his eyes, the way he assumed power just by virtue of his skin and status. Michael had felt that power before, in the boardrooms where the decisions that affected his life were made by people who didn't care to understand the lives they were ruining. He had felt it in the way his boss, Richard Turner, always patted him on the back with a false sense of camaraderie, while never really acknowledging his worth as a person. Michael had been swallowing it all for years. Small indignities, slighted remarks, microaggressions, and all the ways in which his existence was deemed less important. But Yasmin's question had shattered something inside him. Could he keep letting these things slide? Could he keep pretending that he was okay with the system that kept his family in their place? The next day he called in sick to work. He wasn't sick, but he needed space. He needed time to think. Yasmin, sensing his quiet mood, stayed close to him, giving him no chance to forget what had happened. The incident at the hotel seemed to hang over them like a dark cloud, and even though Michael had tried to shield her from it, Yasmin was learning the painful truth about the world's biases. At her school, Yasmin's day mirrored her father's. She was greeted with subtle stares and overheard whispers as soon as she stepped into the classroom. At lunch, one of the popular girls, with platinum blonde hair and a shiny white smile, had asked her why she wasn't sitting at the black table. Yasmin didn't know what to say, so she just sat alone, her lunch untouched in front of her. Michael could see the change in her when she came home. The way she held her shoulders a little tighter, the way her eyes darted nervously when she spoke. He wanted to protect her from all of it, but how could he? How could he protect her from a world that had already started to shape her with its cruel assumptions? That night, as he sat in front of the TV, he felt a rage that was so familiar it almost paralyzed him. It was the same feeling he'd had when he was younger, when he'd seen his father come home with the same defeated look on his face after another long day of being treated like he didn't matter. The system was rigged. Had always been rigged. The only difference was, now Michael could see it so clearly. His thoughts were interrupted when his phone buzzed. A message from Richard Turner, his boss. "Hey Michael, I heard about the incident at the hotel. That was unfortunate. I'm sorry it happened to you. Let's talk tomorrow about how we can move forward." Michael stared at the text, the familiar sense of resentment creeping into his chest. Richard's apology wasn't an apology. It was just another way of making it seem like the whole thing was an isolated event, a one-off, as if it was something that could just be brushed aside. Michael's fists clenched. He had worked for Richard for years, keeping his head down, doing his job well, hoping one day he'd be recognized for something more than just his role. But he had to face the truth. Richard wasn't going to help him. No one was. He would always be less than in their eyes. He put the phone down and sat in the silence. His mind drifted back to Yasmin, to her face as she'd asked him that question. Why didn't he want us there? Maybe it was time to stop pretending. Maybe it was time to speak up, not just for himself, but for Yasmin. She needed to see that he was more than just someone who would tolerate injustice. That night, after Yasmin had gone to bed, Michael made a decision. He wasn't going to let the world take away his family's dignity any longer. He didn't know what it would cost him, but he was ready to fight. He was done being silent. Tomorrow he would face Richard Turner. And he would tell him the truth. The next morning, Michael forced himself out of bed earlier than usual, despite the gnawing fatigue that had settled deep in his bones. Yasmin was still asleep, curled up tightly under her blanket, unaware of the storm brewing in her father's chest. He glanced at her, wishing more than anything that he could shield her from this heavy world. But he couldn't. Not anymore. The hotel incident still haunted him, but now it felt different. He wasn't going to let it slide. Richard Turner had texted him the night before, offering a casual apology, but it felt hollow, like another attempt to sweep things under the rug. Michael wasn't stupid. He knew Richard's world, the world of the rich and powerful, where the color of his skin would always be a reminder of his place in society. No amount of politeness or false camaraderie could erase that. Michael had worked for Richard for years, keeping his head down, doing his job well, hoping for a break that never came. It wasn't just the little injustices at the hotel. It was the way Richard treated him at work, how the other employees, mostly white, always got the better assignments while Michael, the janitor, stayed out of sight, cleaning up after the mess they made. He was invisible, a necessary but disposable cog in the machine. But now he was done being invisible. After a quick shower and a cup of black coffee that barely registered in his tired body, Michael grabbed his coat and headed out the door. He didn't know what he expected to happen when he walked into the office, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to sit back and let the injustice fester any longer. The building was buzzing as usual when Michael arrived. People in suits hurried through the lobby, exchanging casual greetings that Michael never fully understood. Small talk laced with subtle barbs and unspoken hierarchy. He hated it, the way people moved through the world like they were all playing a game with rules they never bothered to explain. He knew the rules. He just wasn't allowed to play. Richard's office was on the top floor, as it always was, with large windows offering a view of the skyline. Michael knocked once before stepping in, taking in the familiar smell of expensive leather and wood polish. Richard stood behind his polished mahogany desk, his expression neutral as he glanced up from a report. "Michael, good to see you," Richard said, his voice warm but lacking any real depth. He extended his hand, a practiced smile on his face. Michael shook it, his grip firm but not eager. He wasn't here to be polite. "Mr. Turner," Michael said, his voice steady. "We need to talk." Richard raised an eyebrow, a small flicker of surprise crossing his face. "Of course, take a seat." Michael sat, feeling the plush leather chair beneath him. It was comfortable, yes, but it didn't give him the reassurance it used to. Now it felt more like a trap. He wasn't going to let this conversation end with another empty apology. "I'm not here to talk about the hotel incident in some neutral way," Michael started, his tone low but firm. "I'm here because it's time to face some truths." Richard leaned back in his chair, folding his hands in front of him. "Okay, Michael, go on. What truths are you referring to?" Michael felt his pulse quicken, but he pushed through. "I've worked here for a long time. I've done everything you've asked. But the way people like me are treated, well, it's been hard to ignore." Richard gave him a tight smile. "I'm not sure I follow, Michael. We've always treated you with respect." "Respect?" Michael couldn't hold back the bitterness in his voice. I'm a janitor, Richard. Do you think I don't see how the rest of the staff looks at me? How I'm treated like I don't matter? I've worked here for years and… Michael, I'm not sure this is the place for such a discussion, Richard interrupted, his voice sharpening just a little. I think you're reading too much into things. This isn't about race or class. It's about… No, Michael cut him off, his voice growing louder. It is about race and class. I've seen it. I've felt it. And I've tolerated it because I thought one day maybe I'd get a break. But that's not going to happen, is it? Richard's smile faltered, and for the first time in all these years, Michael saw the faintest hint of discomfort cross his boss's face. It was a fleeting moment, gone as quickly as it had appeared, but it was enough. Michael leaned forward, locking eyes with him. You've made it clear that people like me are never going to get a real chance here. You keep us in our place, Richard. I keep hearing how much this company values diversity, but what does that really mean if we're just cleaning up after everyone else's mess, never allowed to step into the light? Richard's fingers tapped against the desk, his gaze a little too focused. Michael, I didn't mean for this to become an issue. But let's not get carried away here. We all have our roles to play. That's how things work. Michael stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the polished floor. He'd heard enough. And that's the problem right there, he said, his voice thick with frustration. You think it's just about roles. But for people like me, it's never just a job. It's a life sentence. Richard's eyes flickered to the door, his smile faltering. Look, I understand you're upset. And I know things aren't perfect, but we can work together to find a solution. I don't want your solutions anymore, Michael interrupted, his voice low and controlled. I want change. Real change. And it starts with you, Richard. The room was silent for a beat. Richard's face had gone pale, his eyes darting between Michael and the door. He wasn't used to confrontation, especially not like this. The balance of power, always so skewed, felt suddenly off balance. Michael didn't give him a chance to respond. He turned toward the door, his heart hammering in his chest. As he opened it, he glanced back over his shoulder, locking eyes with Richard one last time. I don't know if you'll ever change, but I'm done pretending that everything's fine. This system, it's broken. With that, he left the office, the door closing softly behind him, but the weight of his words hung heavily in the air. As Michael stepped into the hallway, his mind raced. He had just burned a bridge. But something inside him felt lighter. He had spoken his truth, and even if Richard never listened, at least Michael knew he wasn't going to stand idly by anymore. This was only the beginning. Michael didn't sleep much that night. His mind kept replaying his confrontation with Richard, the look of discomfort in his boss's eyes, the way his words had shifted, even if only for a moment. It was a small victory, but it wasn't enough. He knew that. He could feel the weight of all the years he had spent swallowing his anger, keeping his head down and accepting his place. That night, as he sat in the dimly lit living room, the TV on but not really being watched, Michael couldn't stop the flood of memories that came crashing over him. It was like an old film reel, the images flickering in his mind, one after another, so clear, so vivid, as though he was reliving his childhood all over again. His father's face was the first image that came to him. It was a hot summer day in 1984, and young Michael sat on the cracked sidewalk outside their apartment building, watching his father work on the old rusted car parked near the curb. The engine sputtered, coughing up a cloud of smoke, and his father, tall and broad-shouldered with a permanent scowl on his face, wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. He looked tired. Michael could see the lines of exhaustion etched into his father's face, lines that had come far too early. His father had been working his entire life, slaving away in factories and on construction sites, only to find that the harder he worked, the less he had to show for it. "You okay, Pops?" Michael asked from the steps, the question heavy in the air, though he knew his father would never answer it the way he wanted. His father didn't respond right away. Instead, he just kept working, his hands moving with mechanical precision as he tinkered with the car's engine. Michael had asked him that same question dozens of times over the years, always with the same result. His father never spoke about his struggles, never told him how hard it was. But Michael could feel it in the silence, in the way his father would come home late, too tired to say more than a few words before collapsing into the couch. "Yes, son," his father said finally, his voice low and steady. "Just fixing this damn thing so it'll run for another year." Michael nodded, unsure of what to say. He had watched his father over the years, seeing how the world had beaten him down. There had been no real opportunity, no upward mobility, no breaking free from the system that kept him tethered to the same menial jobs, scraping by. And yet, his father had never said anything about it. He just kept his head down, working until his hands bled, hoping things would change. But they never did. Michael hadn't realized it at the time, but his father was teaching him a lesson of silence, of endurance. The memory faded, but it left behind a bitter aftertaste in Michael's mouth. His father had always accepted his place. Michael had seen it in his eyes, the resignation, the weariness. It was as if he had come to terms with the fact that people like him would always be at the bottom, no matter how much they tried to fight. The world would never let him rise. But Michael wasn't like that. He wasn't going to stay silent, not after everything that had happened with Yasmin, not after what he had faced at the hotel. He couldn't. The next morning, as Michael sat at the kitchen table, the weight of yesterday's conversation still lingering in his chest, Yasmin came down the stairs, looking at him with those wide eyes that never seemed to miss a thing. "Morning, Dad," she said, giving him a small smile, though Michael could see the hint of unease in her expression. "Morning, sweetheart," Michael replied, his voice hoarse. He had barely slept. The darkness of his thoughts had kept him awake, running through the endless list of things that had to be done, things that had been done to him and his family. Yasmin sat across from him, her backpack slung over her shoulder. She had a school project to finish, but Michael could tell that she wasn't quite focused on it. The same heaviness that had been weighing on him seemed to have settled into her too. "I don't want to go to school today," Yasmin said softly, her eyes downcast as she fiddled with the corner of the paper on the table. Michael's heart sank. "Why not, baby?" Yasmin hesitated before answering, her voice small. "Some of the kids at school, they said I didn't belong, that I wasn't like them." Michael's breath caught in his throat. He had known this day would come, but hearing it from her, from his little girl, tore at him in a way he hadn't anticipated. Yasmin was only 12, still so full of life and innocence. She wasn't supposed to carry this weight. He wasn't supposed to let her carry this weight. But the world had already started to chip away at her, and he couldn't stop it. "I'm sorry, Yasmin," he whispered, his voice tight with emotion. "I never wanted you to feel this way. I thought I could protect you from this. But the truth is, it's out there and it's real." Yasmin looked up at him, her eyes searching his face, looking for answers. "Why does it have to be this way, Dad? Why can't I just be like them?" Michael shook his head, his throat closing up. "I wish I could give you an answer. I wish I could make it better. But the truth is, Yasmin, people like you and me, we're going to face things that others don't. It's not fair and it's not right, but it's the way the world is. But that doesn't mean we have to take it. We can stand up. We can fight." Yasmin's eyes were wide now, a mix of confusion and determination. She didn't fully understand, but he could see the spark of resilience in her, the same fire that burned in him. "What do we do?" she asked quietly. Michael took a deep breath, the weight of it all crashing down on him. He had spent years in silence, accepting the system for what it was. But now he knew better. He had to do something. Not just for himself, but for Yasmin, for the future they both deserved. "We fight," he said firmly, the words ringing in his ears like a vow. "We fight with everything we've got." As Yasmin went off to school, Michael sat alone at the kitchen table, his mind spinning. He knew the fight wasn't going to be easy, that it would take everything from him. His energy, his time, his peace of mind. But the thought of letting his daughter face this world without standing up for her made his blood boil. He had lived in the shadow of his father's silence for too long. It was time for something different. It was time to speak. It was time to act. And this time, he wasn't going to let anyone silence him. The weeks following his conversation with Richard had been a whirlwind. Michael couldn't stop thinking about the promises he had made. To Yasmin, to himself, and to the world that had tried to silence them both. He had done his best to keep his head down at work, but his thoughts kept drifting back to the hotel incident, to his father's silent suffering, and to Yasmin's unspoken pain. He was done with silence. One afternoon, after finishing his shift, Michael walked into his small apartment. His shoes still covered in the dust and grime of the day's work. Yasmin was sitting at the kitchen table, her school books spread out in front of her. She was scribbling in a notebook, her brow furrowed as she focused on an assignment. "Hey, Yasmin," he called as he entered, trying to sound casual despite the storm of thoughts in his mind. She looked up, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "Hi, Dad. How was work?" "Same as usual," he replied, but his voice lacked the usual resignation. This time there was a fire behind his words. He was tired of it all. The long hours, the belittling glances, the idea that hard work alone would somehow make a difference. It was time to show Yasmin something different. "Actually," he continued, taking a deep breath, "I've been thinking. We can't just let this slide anymore. We need to do something." Yasmin looked at him, her eyes wide with curiosity. "What do you mean, Dad?" Michael sat down beside her, leaning forward, his hands pressed against the table. He could feel the weight of his words in his chest, the anger that had built up over the years threatening to explode. But this time it wasn't about lashing out. It was about action. "We need to make our voices heard," he said firmly. "I'm tired of people like us being treated like we don't matter. I've spent too long just taking it, Yasmin. But that ends now." Yasmin's eyes lit up. She had always been the quieter one, the one who observed more than she spoke. But over the past few weeks, she had started to change. The school protests, small but meaningful, had sparked something in her. She was starting to understand that she didn't have to stay silent, that her voice, too, had power. "What if we did something at school?" Yasmin asked hesitantly, looking up at him. "What if we got other kids to help?" Michael felt a surge of pride in his chest. His daughter was starting to take the lead in her own way. "That's exactly what I was thinking," he said, nodding. "We can organize something. Protest. Not just for us, but for everyone who's been treated like we don't belong. We can make it known that we won't stand by and let people keep treating us this way." Yasmin's face lit up with excitement. "I can talk to some of my friends at school. Maybe we can get the teachers involved, too." Michael smiled. "Yes, start small but make it clear. We'll reach out to other schools, too. We'll show them that we're not afraid to stand up." That evening, Yasmin began working on flyers, writing slogans and gathering ideas. Michael spent hours researching local organizations that focused on anti-racism, diversity education, and advocacy. He wasn't just going to let this be some schoolyard protest. This was bigger than that. It was about raising awareness, creating a movement, one that would have far-reaching consequences. The following week, Yasmin's school became ground zero for a wave of resistance. What started as a small conversation between a handful of students soon turned into something larger. Yasmin, fueled by the fire her father had ignited, became the face of the movement in her school. She talked to students during lunch, rallied support from the teachers, and even convinced the school administration to allow an official protest to take place. Michael watched in awe as his daughter took charge, her words resonating with her peers in a way he hadn't expected. She wasn't just standing up for herself. She was standing up for every student who had ever been made to feel inferior, for every child who had ever been told they didn't belong. The day of the protest came, and the air was thick with anticipation. Students and teachers alike gathered outside the school, holding up signs that read "Our Lives Matter," "No More Silence," and "We Belong" in bold letters. Yasmin stood at the front of the crowd, a microphone in her hand, as she prepared to speak. The crowd fell silent as she stepped up to the podium, her voice shaking only slightly as she addressed them. We've been told for too long that we don't belong. We've been told that our voices don't matter. But today we stand together and we say, enough. We will no longer be silent. We will no longer allow the world to treat us like we're invisible. This is our fight. And we will not back down. The crowd erupted in applause, the energy in the air crackling with an intensity Michael had never felt before. For the first time in years he felt hope. Hope that things could change. That people could change. The protest didn't end that day. It sparked something that spread throughout the community, reaching other schools, other neighborhoods. People who had been silent for far too long began to speak up. The ripple effect of Yasmin's bravery was undeniable. It wasn't just a protest, it was a movement. At home, Michael couldn't stop smiling. His heart swelled with pride as he watched Yasmin's interviews on local news, her words cutting through the noise of the world like a beacon. She was becoming a leader in her own right. But there was still so much more to be done. Michael knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. They had to keep pushing, keep speaking out, keep resisting. They couldn't let the world forget that they mattered. And as Michael sat with Yasmin that night, the weight of everything still lingering on his shoulders, he knew one thing for certain. They were no longer going to be silent. This fight, this resistance had just begun. It had been a week since Yasmin's protest, and the energy in the air had changed. The city felt more charged, more alive with voices raised in unity. But even in the midst of this newfound solidarity, Michael felt a tension building that he couldn't shake. Things at work were no different. Richard's apology had been nothing more than a facade, a way of brushing off his discomfort and pretending the world hadn't shifted beneath them. Michael had made waves in his confrontation with Richard, but the fallout was heavier than he had anticipated. At first, he had felt empowered, watching Yasmin speak out and take a stand. He had felt proud, like maybe the small, silent world he had lived in for so long was finally waking up. But as the protests gained traction and media coverage grew, Michael found himself facing something he hadn't prepared for: the reality of what it meant to fight back. It wasn't just the higher-ups at his job that were starting to notice. It was everyone. Whispers circulated through the halls of the building, in the break room, in the elevator. People were talking about him. His challenge to Richard Turner wasn't the issue. It was the fact that he had broken the unspoken rule. Don't make waves. Don't disrupt the status quo. And Michael had done both. He knew Richard was behind some of the rumors circulating. The whispers about his attitude, his insubordination, and even worse, suggestions that Michael wasn't grateful for the opportunities he had been given. In a way, Richard was right. Michael had been lucky in a sense. He had a job, even if it was a low-paying one, a position that kept him working in the shadows of the building while the real decision-makers, the rich white men, ran the show. But to Richard, the problem wasn't the system itself. It was Michael's refusal to play his part quietly. Michael felt the pressure building as the days went by. The demands at work were piling up. His responsibilities were increasing, not because of his skills or contributions, but as a way of burying him under more menial tasks. He was being pushed to the brink, and it wasn't just about the workload. It was the invisible weight of the subtle, coded racism that still lingered in every corner of the office. It was the sideways glances, the way people avoided eye contact when he passed, the way he was expected to keep his head down and do his job without question. Then, one afternoon, everything came to a head. Michael's phone buzzed while he was cleaning the executive floor. He glanced at the screen, recognizing the number. It was Richard. "Michael, can you come to my office?" Richard's voice on the other end was tight, professional, but there was an underlying edge to it. The kind of tone that made Michael's stomach twist. "Sure," Michael replied, wiping his hands on his uniform as he made his way to the elevator. He could already feel his pulse quicken, a sense of dread crawling over him. This was it. He had been waiting for this moment, the moment when Richard would finally address the rift between them. The elevator doors opened on the top floor, and Michael stepped out into the pristine, quiet space. He knocked lightly on Richard's door before entering, his mind racing. Richard was sitting behind his desk, his suit jacket off, sleeves rolled up to reveal his muscular forearms. He looked at Michael with an expression that was almost too calm, as though he were preparing for a difficult conversation. "Sit down," Richard gestured toward the chair in front of his desk. Michael sat, his back straight, his hands folded in his lap. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing on him. "I've been hearing some things around the office," Richard began, his eyes narrowing slightly. "People are talking about you, about your behavior." Michael's heart skipped a beat. He knew exactly where this was going. "What about it?" Richard leaned forward, his voice dropping a notch. "There's been talk that you're causing trouble, that you're not a good fit for the team. I've had a few complaints, Michael, and I need to know where you stand. Because, quite frankly, the way you're behaving isn't what we expect from someone in your position." Michael's breath caught in his throat. The words were dripping with the kind of subtle manipulation that Richard was so good at. It wasn't direct, it was insinuation, veiled threats masked as concern. Richard wasn't concerned about Michael's behavior. He was concerned about control. "I'm just doing my job," Michael said, keeping his voice steady despite the anger rising in him. "But I'm not going to pretend everything is fine when it's not." Richard's eyes flashed with something dangerous. "You think this is about the protest? You think this is about you standing up for yourself? 'Cause let me tell you something, Michael. You're not in some high school rally anymore. You're working in a professional environment. And if you want to keep that job, I suggest you remember your place." The words hit Michael like a slap to the face. He had known Richard's biases, hell, he had lived with them for years, but to hear them laid out so plainly, so coldly, was something else entirely. "You can't intimidate me anymore, Richard," Michael said quietly, his voice calm but filled with a quiet intensity. "I'm not going to let you or anyone else keep me in my place." Richard stood up suddenly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He stepped around the desk, leaning in close to Michael. His breath was heavy, his posture threatening. "You think you can just waltz in here and start making demands? You think you can disrupt everything and still expect to be treated like one of us?" Michael didn't flinch. His heart was pounding, but his resolve was stronger than ever. "I'm not one of you, Richard. And I don't want to be." The silence between them stretched, thick with tension. Richard's jaw clenched, and for a brief moment, Michael thought he might actually strike him. But instead, Richard straightened up, his expression hardening. "Fine," Richard said, his voice cold. "You'll regret this. I can promise you that." Michael stood, his own anger burning through him. "I'm not afraid of you, Richard." He turned and walked out of the office, his footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. The doors to the elevator felt like an escape. As the doors closed, Michael leaned against the wall, letting out a breath he hadn't realized he had been holding. He knew this conversation had just sealed his fate at the company, but he didn't care. He had just made a choice. He wasn't going to be silenced anymore. Not for his job, not for anyone. Back in his apartment that evening, Yasmin greeted him with her usual enthusiasm, but Michael couldn't hide the weariness in his eyes. She noticed. "Dad?" she asked, concern creeping into her voice. "What happened?" Michael took a deep breath, the weight of everything pressing down on him. "It's over, Yasmin. I might not have that job much longer. But that's okay." Yasmin's eyes widened, her expression filled with worry. "What are we going to do?" "We're going to keep fighting," Michael said, his voice steady despite the storm of uncertainty inside him. "We're going to keep speaking out. Because nothing changes if we stay silent." And for the first time in a long while, Michael felt a glimmer of something stronger than fear. It was hope. Hope that, even in the face of everything falling apart, they could still make a difference. The phone call came in the late afternoon, just as Michael was finishing up the last of his tasks for the day. He had been half expecting it, knowing that Richard's threats were no empty words, but even so, the sharpness in his voice when he answered still made his stomach twist. "Michael," Richard said, his voice clipped, "I need you to come in tomorrow. We need to discuss your future here." The words hit like a ton of bricks. Michael knew what that meant. He could almost hear Richard's smile on the other end of the line, the satisfaction of finally having the upper hand. But Michael wasn't the same man who had walked into the office months ago. He wasn't afraid of Richard anymore. "I'll be there," Michael said simply before hanging up. He stared at the phone for a moment, the weight of the conversation settling in his chest. What now? What was the next step when everything he had fought for was now on the line? Michael stood up, his thoughts spinning, and walked over to the small kitchen. Yasmin was finishing her homework at the table, the quiet click of her pen punctuating the otherwise still air. The tension in the apartment was palpable. It was as if the entire world was holding its breath, waiting for the next move. He didn't want to burden Yasmin with his problems. She had enough to deal with, her protests at school, her own struggles with the discrimination she faced. But Michael could see the shift in her eyes when she looked up at him. She knew something was wrong. "What happened, Dad?" Yasmin asked, her voice small but determined. Michael took a seat across from her, staring at her with a mixture of pride and sadness. She was growing up so fast, too fast for his liking. He had promised her that things would get better, that they wouldn't have to keep fighting forever. But he knew now that the road ahead wasn't that simple. "They want to fire me, Yasmin," Michael said, his voice calm despite the storm of emotion inside him. "Richard's made it clear that my job here is done. I won't back down from what I believe in, and he's not going to let me stay if I don't fall in line." Yasmin's face hardened, her small fists clenching in frustration. "That's not fair, Dad. You shouldn't have to choose between your job and doing the right thing." "I know," Michael replied, his voice thick with the weight of his own frustration. "But sometimes, Yasmin, that's how things work. The world isn't always fair." She shook her head. "No, Dad. That's not right. You're doing the right thing. You have to keep going." Michael smiled at her, his heart swelling with pride. In the face of everything, Yasmin was still the bright spark in his life. She didn't just see the injustice, they both saw it. And they weren't going to stop fighting. Not now. Not ever. The next morning, Michael walked into the office, his shoulders squared, his heart heavy with the knowledge that this might be his last day working there. He had known this moment would come, but now that it was here, the reality was sharper than he had anticipated. He stepped into the elevator, the cold steel walls closing in around him, as if the world were slowly shutting him out. Richard's office was on the top floor as always, and when the elevator doors opened, Michael could already feel the weight of the conversation hanging in the air. He walked down the long hallway, each step echoing in the empty space, his thoughts racing. When he knocked and entered Richard's office, the sight of his boss standing behind his desk, hands clasped, eyes hard, confirmed his worst fears. Richard didn't even offer him a seat. The power dynamics had already been established. Michael knew the game. He had played it for years, but today he wasn't going to play along. "Michael," Richard began, his voice cool and professional, "you've been a valuable member of this company, but I'm afraid your recent actions have put us in a difficult position. We cannot allow personal agendas to interfere with company business. Your outspoken behavior has become a liability." Michael felt his pulse quicken, but he didn't flinch. He had come here for this moment. He wasn't going to be intimidated. "I didn't come here to play games, Richard," Michael said, his voice firm, unwavering. "You want to fire me. Fine. But know this, I'm not the problem here. The system, the way this company operates, that's the problem. And I'm done pretending it's not." Richard's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening. This isn't personal, Michael. It's about what's best for the company. I'm giving you one last chance to leave quietly. No hard feelings. Michael took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the years of silence pressing against him. He could feel the anger rising, but it wasn't the kind of rage that led to violence or reckless words. It was something sharper, more controlled. You can fire me, Richard, Michael said quietly, but you can't silence me. You can't make me pretend that everything's fine. You can't erase the truth. Richard's face twisted into a scowl. You think you're some kind of hero, he spat. You think you're making a difference. You're just a janitor, Michael. And you always will be. The words stung, but Michael didn't let them show. He had heard it all before. But this time it wasn't just about him. It was about Yasmin, about the future he wanted for her. He couldn't let that future be defined by people like Richard. I might be a janitor, Michael said, his voice calm, almost too calm. But I'm not a fool. And I'm not your punching bag. You can fire me today, but it doesn't change the truth. The system is broken. And you're part of that system. You can't escape that, no matter how many people you push down. There was a long silence as Richard stared at him, the tension in the room thick enough to cut with a knife. Richard stood motionless. His eyes locked on Michael. Fine, Richard said finally. His voice low, almost a growl. You're done here. Michael nodded slowly. His heart still heavy but no longer fearful. I'll go. But just know this. The fight isn't over. Not for me. And not for anyone who's ever been made to feel like they don't belong. Michael turned and walked out of Richard's office, feeling the weight of the decision in his chest. But there was something else too. A sense of relief. He had taken a stand. He had refused to be silenced. And somehow that felt like a victory. That afternoon, Yasmin called him as he sat in the park near the apartment. Her voice was full of excitement. Dad, they're talking about us on the news. The protest. They're saying it's spreading everywhere. People are starting to listen. Michael smiled, his heart swelling with pride. Good. Let them hear us. Let them see what happens when we stop being quiet. For the first time in a long time, Michael felt hope. Maybe they hadn't won yet, but they had started something. And he knew that this fight, this movement, was only just beginning. The morning after Michael was officially fired from his job, he woke up to the sound of his phone buzzing. It was a message from Yasmin. The excitement in her voice over text was palpable, even through the screen. Dad, you're not going to believe it. They've started covering the protest on national news. It's everywhere. People are talking about us, and the schools are starting to take action. It's working, Dad. We're making a difference. Michael's heart swelled. He had known that Yasmin's courage would spark something, but the way it had exploded, the way it was now echoing across the country, was something he hadn't quite expected. They weren't just a small ripple anymore. They were a tidal wave. As he sat there, in the quiet stillness of his apartment, Michael reflected on the months of struggle that had brought him here. The insult at the hotel, the endless microaggressions at work, the pain of seeing his daughter, the child he had tried so hard to protect, slowly learn about the harsh realities of the world. All of it had led to this moment. But the road hadn't been easy. The protests had grown larger, yes. But they had come at a cost. The community had rallied behind them, but with that support came scrutiny. Michael knew they weren't out of the woods yet. The powers that be wouldn't let go so easily. The fight was far from over. Later that afternoon, Michael met Yasmin at the local coffee shop, the place they had always gone when they needed a moment of peace in the chaos of their lives. Yasmin was already sitting at a table by the window, her fingers tapping rhythmically on her phone. She looked up when he entered, a bright smile spreading across her face. Dad, you won't believe this, she said before he even had a chance to sit down. They're doing a whole segment about you and the protest on the local news tonight. You're going to be on TV. Michael chuckled softly, shaking his head. I never thought I'd be making headlines like this, Yasmin. Everyone's talking about it. They're calling it a turning point, she said, her eyes sparkling with excitement. This is bigger than we thought. But as Michael looked into his daughter's face, he saw more than just excitement. He saw the same quiet determination that had been with her from the start. Yasmin had always been driven, but now she was carrying something else too, an understanding of the world's complexity and a willingness to challenge it. That's amazing, Yasmin, Michael said, his voice full of pride. But we're not done. We have to keep pushing. This is just the beginning. As they sat and talked, Yasmin's phone buzzed again. She checked it quickly, and her smile faded, replaced by a look of concern. What is it? Michael asked, leaning forward. It's about John Preston, Yasmin said, her voice suddenly shaky. The rich man who made that comment to you at the hotel. They just found out he's been involved in some shady dealings. His company's been under investigation for financial fraud. And now, because of everything that's come out, people are calling for him to step down. Michael's stomach churned. He had never expected this. He had only wanted justice for what had happened to him and Yasmin. But now, in a twist of fate, the man who had humiliated them was being exposed for something much worse than an offhand comment. The truth had a way of coming out, even when it was least expected. He remembered the smug look on Preston's face when he had insulted him in that hotel lobby. How the man had so easily dismissed Michael and Yasmin as insignificant. Now, Michael could see the poetic justice unfolding before him. Preston, the man who had tried to belittle him, was about to lose everything. His empire, built on the backs of people like Michael, was about to come crashing down. It's happening, Yasmin, Michael said softly, staring at the screen of her phone as the news anchor recounted the growing scandal. The walls are coming down for people like him. And they'll keep coming down. Over the next few days, the momentum continued to build. Protests spread to other cities. News outlets picked up the story, both about the protests and about John Preston's corruption. The world was finally starting to pay attention. What had begun as a local movement in Michael's community had transformed into a national conversation about race, power, and justice. But even as the world seemed to be shifting, the toll on Michael was palpable. The fallout from his firing was still fresh, and though the protests were gaining ground, Michael knew the personal cost was high. He didn't have a steady income anymore. The stability he had worked so hard for had slipped through his fingers. He was uncertain about what the future would hold for him and Yasmin. Yet there was a strange sense of liberation in all of it. Michael was no longer bound by the silence that had kept him in place for so long. He had stood up, and in doing so, he had given his daughter something invaluable. A voice. A way to confront the injustices that the world tried so hard to bury. The next morning, a lawyer called Michael, offering him a chance to speak publicly about the company's treatment of him and the corrupt practices he had witnessed during his time there. It was an opportunity for him to get his side of the story out, to make sure his truth wasn't lost in the shuffle of corporate politics. The lawyer mentioned the possibility of a lawsuit, but Michael wasn't interested in the money. What mattered now was that people were finally listening. He sat down with Yasmin that night, the two of them watching the news together. The conversation had shifted from fear to hope, from silence to action. And as Michael looked at his daughter, her eyes bright with the same fire that had sparked the protests, he knew one thing: they had already won. The systems that had held them down, the ones that had devalued their lives and their voices, were beginning to unravel. It wasn't perfect. It wouldn't be easy. But for the first time in a long time, Michael believed in the possibility of change. He had stood up for Yasmin. He had stood up for himself. And in doing so, he had given their voices the power to reshape the world around them. It was just the beginning, but it felt like justice. The weeks following Michael's public stand were both exhilarating and exhausting. The protests had not slowed down. In fact, they had intensified. As the calls for systemic change grew louder, the world began to take notice. The media coverage of John Preston's scandal had only escalated, and with it, the pressure on the powerful elite who had kept their foot on the necks of people like Michael for generations. But despite the surge of public support, Michael felt like he was caught in a crossfire. The movement was bigger than he had ever anticipated, but so was the backlash. His phone rang constantly, the calls a mix of offers from journalists, lawyers, and even social justice organizations who wanted to take up his cause. His inbox flooded with messages from well-meaning people, praising him for his bravery. Yet, even in the midst of this newfound attention, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that it was all too much. The weight of what had happened, and what was still happening, was starting to crush him. Yes, his story had sparked change. Yes, the fight had started to take root. But the toll it was taking on his personal life, his sense of security, was becoming harder to ignore. The night before, Yasmin had come to him, her face etched with worry. She had seen the toll the protest had taken on him, even as he tried to hide it. The late-night phone calls, the hours spent with journalists, the endless meetings. It was all wearing him down. "Dad," she had said, her voice quiet but resolute. "Are you okay?" Michael had given her a reassuring smile, but he couldn't deny the fatigue in his eyes. "I'm fine, Yasmin," he had lied. "This is what we've been working for. We can't stop now." But deep down, he knew that it wasn't just about the protest anymore. It was about him, about his life, about how everything he had believed in and worked for had unraveled in the wake of one small action. He had wanted to be heard, but now that he was, it felt like the world was watching him too closely. The next day, Michael was sitting at the kitchen table, absent-mindedly stirring his coffee when he got an unexpected message. It was from an old friend, David, a fellow worker at the company where he had been employed for years. They hadn't spoken much since Michael's departure, but David had always been a voice of reason, someone who had quietly supported him from the sidelines. "Hey man, I heard what happened. I've been following everything on the news. I just wanted to say I'm proud of you. I don't know if I can say this to your face, but I want you to know that what you did made a difference. A lot of us have been talking about it at the office. Some of us are ready to back you up if you decide to take further action." Michael read the message twice, the weight of David's words settling on him. For so long, Michael had been fighting alone. He had fought not only the system but the belief that anyone would ever stand with him. But here it was, an offer of support. The idea that people, even inside the very system that had kept him down, were willing to take a stand with him. It gave him a renewed sense of purpose. He typed out a quick reply. "Thanks, David. I appreciate it. I don't know what's next, but I'm not backing down." Later that week, Michael was invited to speak at a rally in support of workers' rights. It was organized by a group of activists who had been following the protests and the fallout from Preston's scandal. Michael didn't expect it to be anything groundbreaking, but as he stood at the podium, looking out over the crowd of passionate, hopeful faces, something inside him shifted. For the first time in a long time, Michael felt that he was part of something bigger. He wasn't just a man with a story to tell anymore. He wasn't just a victim of a broken system. He was a part of a movement, one that had the potential to change the world. The crowd roared as Michael began to speak, his voice carrying across the microphone. "We've been told for too long that our voices don't matter," Michael said, his eyes scanning the faces in front of him. "We've been told that we have no place at the table. But I'm here to tell you that we are the table. We are the force that drives change. And no matter how hard they try to keep us down, we will rise." The crowd erupted into applause, the sound deafening in the best possible way. For the first time since the protest began, Michael felt a glimmer of hope that this could lead to real change. That evening, after the rally, Michael returned to his apartment, exhausted but filled with a quiet sense of satisfaction. Yasmin was waiting for him when he arrived. She had been following the rally on social media, and her face lit up when she saw him. "Dad," she said, her voice full of excitement, "you were amazing out there. Everyone's talking about it. This is just the beginning. You've started something huge." Michael smiled at her, his heart full. "We've started something, Yasmin. We." He pulled her into a hug, holding her tight. In that moment, he realized that all of the sacrifices, the pain, the anger, the uncertainty, had been worth it. It wasn't just about what he had lost. It was about what they had gained. They had ignited a movement, a spark that would continue to burn long after they were gone. As the weeks went on, the conversation around systemic racism, workers' rights, and corporate accountability continued to grow. Michael and Yasmin became symbols of resistance, not just in their own city but across the country. The support from fellow workers, activists, and everyday people kept pouring in, and the fight was far from over. But for the first time in a long time, Michael felt like they had a real shot at making lasting change. And though the world was still stacked against them, Michael knew that the battle was worth it. Because at the end of the day, the people who had once been silenced, the ones who had been told they didn't belong, had found their voices. And with that, there was nothing they couldn't achieve. For Michael and Yasmin, the fight was just beginning, but the future had never looked more promising. The news had spread like wildfire. The rally, Michael's speech, and the movement they had started had taken on a life of their own. People from all over the country were now standing up, demanding change, inspired by what they had witnessed. Michael and Yasmin had become symbols of resilience, catalysts for a wave of social change. But even as the world seemed to open its eyes, Michael knew that they couldn't let their guard down. They had started something, yes, but the hardest part, the real battle, was still ahead. It had been months since Michael had been fired from his job, and though the initial sting of that loss still lingered, the transformation he had undergone felt like a rebirth. He had stepped out of the shadows, no longer afraid to speak his truth. And in doing so, he had given his daughter something that would last a lifetime, an example of courage, conviction, and the strength to resist. One crisp autumn afternoon, Michael was walking with Yasmin through the park. The air was filled with the earthy scent of fallen leaves, and the sounds of children laughing in the distance reminded him of a simpler time. A time when he had dreamed of a better life for his family, but had never imagined that the road to that future would be so fraught with hardship. "Dad," Yasmin said, her voice soft, pulling him from his thoughts. "What's next for us? What happens now?" Michael stopped walking, taking a moment to look at his daughter. She had always been wise beyond her years, but now, with everything they had been through, she had matured into someone who understood the weight of the world. She was no longer just the daughter of a man who had been beaten down by the system. She was part of a generation that was fighting to rewrite the rules. "What happens next, Yasmin," Michael said, his voice steady, "is that we keep fighting. We keep speaking up, even when it feels like no one is listening. We keep showing up. And most importantly, we never stop believing that change is possible." Yasmin nodded, her eyes shining with determination. "I don't think I could stop now, even if I wanted to. Too many people are depending on us." Michael smiled, proud of the young woman his daughter was becoming. But, as much as he believed in the power of their movement, he knew the road ahead would be long and difficult. The fight for equality, for justice, for the rights of workers and marginalized people, would take years, maybe even generations. And it wouldn't always be easy. But the future was brighter now. The world had been forced to see them, to hear their stories. And once that happened, there was no going back. Days turned into weeks, and Michael's life slowly began to take shape again. He had become involved with several organizations dedicated to fighting systemic racism and advocating for workers' rights. Though he had no steady income yet, he found solace in knowing that his time was now spent on something that mattered more than any job ever could. Yasmin, too, was thriving. She had become a beacon of hope for her peers, an example of what it meant to stand up for what was right, no matter the consequences. The news coverage around the protests had eventually settled into more of a steady drumbeat. The national conversation around racism, workers' rights, and social justice had shifted from a fleeting news cycle to something permanent. Corporate giants like John Preston, who had once been untouchable, were now facing legal battles, public scrutiny, and boycotts from customers and investors alike. It wasn't enough to dismantle the entire system, but it was a start. And for Michael, that was enough for now. One evening, as Michael sat at the kitchen table with Yasmin, they received a surprise visitor. David, the old friend from work who had reached out to Michael after the firing. David walked into their apartment with a broad smile. His presence a welcome distraction from the endless swirl of news and interviews that had consumed Michael's life in recent months. "Good to see you both," David said, setting down a folder on the table before Michael. "I've got some news that might interest you." Michael looked up at him curiously. "What's going on, David?" David grinned. "I've been working with a few others, trying to keep the momentum of the movement going. We've got a major opportunity coming up, an official inquiry into the practices of the company and others like it. We've got whistleblowers, evidence of systemic corruption, and a chance to expose the truth. This could change everything." Michael's heart raced, but he knew this was the moment. This was the opportunity they had been waiting for. The fight was far from over, and it wouldn't be easy, but it was finally starting to feel like the tide was turning in their favor. "Are we ready for this?" Michael asked, looking at Yasmin. She nodded, her face set in determination. "We've already started, Dad. We can't stop now." The days following David's visit were a blur. Michael and Yasmin, along with the growing movement behind them, began to prepare for the coming legal battles. They worked with lawyers, activists, and journalists to build their case. The network of support they had cultivated over the past few months began to coalesce into something far more powerful than either of them had ever imagined. But it wasn't just about the battle against the system anymore. It was about something much deeper. It was about reclaiming their dignity, their power, and their place in a world that had tried to erase them. It was about showing the next generation, the Yasmins of the world, that their voices mattered, that they didn't have to live in the shadows. And as the weeks passed, with the legal battles and protests gaining momentum, Michael felt something shift inside him. For the first time in years, he wasn't just fighting for survival. He was fighting for a better future, not just for his family, but for everyone who had been told they didn't belong. On a quiet evening, as the sun set behind the city skyline, Michael stood on his apartment balcony, looking out at the world before him. Yasmin stood beside him, her hand resting lightly in his. For the first time in a long while, Michael felt a peace he hadn't thought possible. They had fought and were still fighting, not just for themselves but for a world where people like them could live without fear, without shame. A world where everyone had a place at the table. And as the city lights began to flicker on, he knew that, no matter what the future held, they had already made a difference.